I dressed like a mess on purpose. The cardigan had a patch over one elbow and a faint coffee ring near the hem. My jeans were the ones with the hole that kept crawling toward my knee, and my hair fell in a crooked rat's nest because I had decided this morning that if I looked forgettable enough, maybe I wouldn't have to explain anything to anyone. I wanted a blind date to end before it began. No small talk, no expectations, no one asking me where I was going to be in 5 years. Sarah had set it up like a favor, like a lark. I'd call it penance. I owed her $12 for the train ticket and half a pizza. The least I could do was show up and be boring. Rain make a city smell like iron and wet tar. The cafe was the kind with a crooked sign and mismatched chairs, the kind of place that served espresso in chipped mugs and pretended it was quaint. I cupped my coffee like it could be a shield. Outside the window, people bustled under umbrellas, faces blank and purposeful. I wanted to be one of them, anonymous, gray, unreadable. Then the door opened and the room shifted. You notice things differently when you don't expect to be noticed. The door swung in slow, as if the gravity in that tiny room had been altered. He came in with 2 men on either side, broad shoulders, the soft cadence of someone who never rushed, and the air around them was a different temperature. The chatter dimmed. Cups paused halfway to mouths. For a fraction of a second, I thought of film noir and men in suits who never really existed on crosstown mornings. He didn't walk to the counter or toward the pastry case. He looked straight at me, like he'd been looking for me in his head and finally found the line to follow through the crowd. There was a scar at the base of his thumb that caught the light when he slid a hand through his hair. He wore a dark overcoat despite the drizzle, and a silver watch that looked like it had been made for wrists that clench around steering wheels and decisions. When our eyes met, something did a small, dangerous thing inside my throat. It wasn't flattering. It was not even pretty. He arrested the movement of the room with that look, and then, to my furious humiliation, smiled a private little thing that felt like permission to breathe. He didn't sit. He stood near the doorway and regarded me like a question that had always been meant to be solved. Then one of the men with him, tall, hawkish, always late to a joke, moved so that the way out was obstructed, and the man in the coat took a slow step forward. "You're Meyer," he said, plainly, without preface, his voice a low plane of certainty that cut through the clatter. I swallowed. I had mouths to feed, a rent due, a pinched worry in my chest that never really left. I suppose I reddened. I began. "I think you must have me confused with someone else." He laughed, soft and amused, but sympathetic. "You look different when you try to blend in."
A small, cruel observation that could have been kind. But that's you. Before I could answer, a man at another table stood up, eyes pinpricks. "Hey, you don't walk in here like you own the place," he started, and then something in the room snapped. The confrontation that followed was a staccato of noise. The man, drunk, desperate maybe, stepped forward, hands jittering. One of Dante's men moved quicker than the eye and caught the man's wrist, twisting it behind his back with enough force to make him grunt. The cafe rose and fell in a single held breath. Someone screamed for a phone. Sarah, who had nestled in the corner with excessive optimism, looked as if she might pass out. "Please," I said, when one of the men, Marco, the taller one, nearest to me, turned his attention in my direction. "Please, don't make a scene." Dante watched me like someone listening to the way the city had arranged itself around me. For a second, I imagined 1,000 little cameras inside his head, tracking the patterns of my life. He took off his coat slowly, a controlled motion, and offered it toward me as if it were both an apology and a challenge. The coat was warm, smelled faintly of cedar and leather. I should have been insulted. I should have flinched. Instead, my hands closed around the heavy fabric. It fit like a glove. It was the same moment I felt every convenience I'd always been denied fold into my palms. The heat of a proper coat on a winter night, the clean line of new shoes, the muffled certainty that someone else's power could for a time shield me. And then he said the 3 words that mapped the rest of the morning in a single, intemperate stroke. "You're mine." It wasn't exactly possessive the way a man brandishes a trophy. It landed on me more like a vow, like a weather front. The room recoiled as if someone had shouted a name out of a window. The man who'd started the trouble was pinned to a chair with the patience of men who were used to being obeyed. The other patrons edged away. Sarah's hand found mine and squeezed like a small animal. I heard my own heartbeat as if it were a separate instrument trying to sync. "You can't say that," I told him. It was stupid. Brave in the way that someone trying not to cry in a movie can be brave. You can't just... He smiled in a way that almost crumpled the edges of menace into something softer, and then the softer thing settled back into control. "I can," he said. "I already traced you." "Traced me?" I echoed, the word wrong in my mouth. He gestured, and one of his men, Marco, produced a thin square of paper, the sort you used for reservations or checks. It said Maya in block letters, followed by a phone number I didn't recognize. "You sat on this bench 3 weeks ago," he said. "You gave your umbrella to a kid. Someone filmed it from a block away. I saw it. I noticed the way you laughed at the pigeons feeding and the way your fingers trembled when you paid. You were always trying not to be caught." It's not cowardice to be watched. It's something older. Maybe it's the way poverty teaches you how to make yourself small so folks don't see the empty cupboards. Maybe it's the way loneliness tells you the safest thing is to be unseen. I felt every one of those lessons in that moment, like a bruise. "Who are you?" I asked. My voice came out sharper now, as if I could chew the surprise into something easier to swallow. He lifted his chin, and the name was an exhalation. Dante Moretti. There was a ripple of reaction in the room, like heat over a pan. A woman at the counter muttered the name. A man with a newspaper stared with open awe. Until then, he'd been a man at a doorway. At that syllable, he became a story I'd read in half-heard rumors. Moretti, the kind of surname that belonged to family sagas people told at the edges of bars. I had grown up on the wrong side of town where names like his hung in whispered infamy. They were men who wore suits like armor, and who convinced people the rules bent for them. "Moretti?" Sarah breathed, like a prayer or a curse. I said. I should have run. Every instinct that had kept me alive in $200 apartments and 3-day freezer meals said, "Get out now." But the coat was warm and I was tired, and his eyes were not lazy. They were a thing that wanted to read the ledger of me whole. Marco's hand rested on the small of my back, neutral as gravity. "We can take you for coffee somewhere quieter," he said, politeness that felt faintly surgical. "Just to talk. We'll get you home." I looked at Sarah, ready to beg. She was pale but steady, eyes small moons of worry. I looked at the man on the chair, still dazed, still muttering at the injustice of being told not to be loud. And then I did something that surprised me. I negotiated the terms. "No," I said. The word felt threadbare, but it was enough. I don't consent to being taken anywhere." Dante's face did not change much. That was either terrifying or blessed. He leaned in, not crushing, but close enough that I could see the stubble at his jaw. "Too late for that to matter," he said, but his voice had lost a notch of certainty and picked up a sliver, something like apology. Marco moved like a decision. "We'll call you a car," he said. "We'll wait here until it arrives." They didn't wait. A matte black SUV idled outside, door open the way doors are open to take someone into a weatherproofed world. Dante's man had folded the drunk man and the commotion into an efficiency that felt like a machine loop. No one had called the police. No one had even muttered about it. I was inside the car before I could fully understand how I had become a passenger in someone else's plan. Dante sat across from me and watched the way my hands toyed with the hem of my cardigan. For a second, he looked almost something smaller than myth, curious, unarmored. And I wondered if that was what his "you're mine" had meant. Not an object, but a fixation, a hunger turned inward and given a name. "You don't need to be afraid of me," he said. "Isn't that what people say about monsters?" I snapped. "They insist they're gentle." "You called me a monster?" He sounded delighted, which made my skin crawl. "I called you Moretti," I said. Same difference. He laughed quietly, the sound like a door closing. "Names are just the short versions of stories," he said. "You've been writing yours without an audience. I didn't want to be just a witness anymore. I wanted to be part of the scene." That, I later understood, was his way of saying he had been watching me for reasons that had little to do with my chipped mug, and much to do with what it told him, that someone who could afford the small, luminous gestures of kindness without notice was a rare thing. People like him hoarded attention like coin. He mistook my invisibility for a curio to be collected. When the SUV pulled away, I thought of the wet city folding back under itself, of neon reflections streaking like questions. I think I also, stubbornly, believed that if I kept my mouth shut and my hands folded, the whole thing would be a brief, ridiculous blip. We drove. The city became a smear of headlights. He didn't speak much. When he did, it was to ask about nothing.
the color of my hair, the kind of bread I liked. It was unsettlingly intimate. He learned I spent my days at a bodega near the docks and nights folding stock at a warehouse for the extra cash. He said I smelled like rain and cinnamon coffee. He noticed the way I flinched if conversation got too personal. The mansion announced itself before it came into view, a cluster of lights like a small constellational neighborhood, gates, a fountain that threw water into the sky in slow arcs. The car eased up a long lane and stopped before an expanse of marble that hurt my eyes with its brightness. It was obscene the way the place suggested money could buy silence and space. My cardigan felt thin as tissue. Rosa met us at the door with a firmness that had been honed by 1,000 wrong mornings. Her apron was immaculate. Her face held the kind of disapproval that had softened into practicality. She looked me up and down, and then, in a way that could have been kindness or ownership, took my coat and draped it over a chair. "Master Dante," she said, nodding. "You're late this morning." "Rosa," he said, and when he said her name, something gentled further. Respect, a small tenderness like a thread. Marco shepherded us to a sitting room that smelled of lemon oil and oak. There were cushions arranged like mantras. Someone handed me a glass of water as if I were fragile. I drank until it felt like I might wake up. They told me later that I would be safe there for as long as it took. The words were both promise and statute.
I understood, in a way that had nothing to do with sentencing, that leaving that night would be difficult. I also understood that staying would require trades. They gave me a room that looked like it belonged in a magazine. High windows, clean linen, the kind of bed that made you forget your backaches. A bag of clothes sat on the chair. Not new clothes exactly, but clean and well-made. A sweater with a flawless seam. Jeans that fit without intimate betrayal. It felt like an offense. I changed in the bathroom, the tiles cool against my knees. The mirror a glass that reflected a woman I half recognized. I took a long shower because it was the one thing I could do that felt wholly mine. At dinner, Dante sat across from me and removed his gloves like a gentleman removing ceremony. He watched me over the rim of a glass as if measuring reaction, like someone cataloging fine wines. The house gave him a stage, and he used it with economy. Marco and Rosa hovered like margin notes. "You work at Delgado's," he said casually. "You like the sandwiches down on 9th. You have a cousin who owes you a favor." He tapped at the stem of his wine glass, and the sound was a very sharp thing. "How do you know all that?" I asked. "I have a network," he said. He did not use the softer word business. He chose instead the blunt language of territory. "I know what my people see. They tell me things I need to know." I felt my jaw clench. "Your people watch me?" I said. It was a demand more than a question. "We watch for threats," he said. "Your building showed up on our perimeter as a place where people with small kindnesses get taken in by the wrong sort. I didn't want you to be someone who got taken." "You still took me," I said, and the accusation sat in the room like a live wire. He looked at me steadily, then nodded. "I did," he said, "and for that I owe you an apology." There was, in his apology, a retractable thing, acknowledgement without surrender. It felt curated. But the next thing he did loosened something in me that had nothing to do with trust and everything to do with evidence. "Do you want privacy?" he asked, as if to a person bargaining for rent money. "I can have it arranged." "Yes," I said. It surprised me that I could be so short, so raw. "I want my phone. I want my life to be mine, not someone's dossier." He nodded. "We will not access your phone. I will order that the feeds we have of your building be purged." There was a small pause, a human thing in the gears. Then Marco rose and left the room. Rosa's eyes flicked to me and back to Dante, as if weighing the truth of his promise. "I don't do second chances easily," Dante said quietly. "Not with people who have been hurt. But I will try. If you set me rules, I'll do my best to follow them." "Do you think you can change?" I asked, because it felt fair to ask, because gods know the men in my neighborhood never asked for repair, only surrender. He looked at me for a long time.
"I have changed things I swore I never could," he said. "I can change these," he tapped his chest. "But I will need accountability." It was a ridiculous moment of absurd hope. There was something almost childish about the idea that a man who built his life on walls could open doors. But I had watched people before, friends, coworkers, turn their edges toward gentleness slowly, and sometimes that gentleness stuck. We made 3 tangible rules that night, written on a napkin between the salt and the pepper, like a peace treaty etched in grease. I would be allowed my phone and privacy, he would order the removal of surveillance that pertained to my life, and I would be offered a temporary job within the estate, something practical, paid, and legit, so I didn't have to go back to the warehouse for survival while I figured things out. He envisioned his own accountability. Rosa would check in with me every day. Marco would, if I wanted, teach me self-defense so I could stop feeling like a victim. Dante promised he would not access my messages or friends without my explicit permission. He said all this with a sincerity that made me feel simultaneously like a cat and like a banker, wary and somewhat reassured. I asked one more thing. I don't know why I did. Maybe because of the obligation of a woman who had learned that asking matters more than explanations. If you want me to stay, I said, you won't speak to me like I'm inventory. He looked slightly amused and then solemn. I won't, he said, but understand this. My attention is not nothing. If you're in my orbit, people get interested. They notice. That's a risk. You're admitting your possessiveness, I said, because the country of my life was frankness. I'm admitting it, he said. I'm not asking for permission to be it. I'm stating it so we can test the boundaries. That admission landed with the force of truth. Possession, protection, they are twin words that look like sisters until you live with them. It made me think of the way my mother put locks on the cupboards and called it care. When it was time to sleep, I found myself on the edge of a mattress that didn't remember the shape of my hips. The house sighed with the hush of other people's choices. I lay awake, fingers grazing the napkin with our rules, and felt, absurdly, the comfort of a promise scrawled between salt and pepper. The next morning, Marco took me on a slow tour of the estate, as if to introduce me to the components of a life I'd never had. He showed me the small garden, walled vegetables, herbs coiled like green whispers. He showed me a small room that was to be my workplace if I accepted. Inventory, stocking, the kind of honest labor I preferred to something that paid in secrets. Rosa gave me a bag with food she'd cooked, and in the corner of the kitchen a small radio played a song I recognized from adolescence. There was a study, later, that smelled of paper and cigarette ash. This was Dante's room when he wanted to be more himself. Books leaned like careful soldiers, a wall of monitors dimmed to sleep like inert satellites. I stood before them and felt an old, very human panic. This was the room where he could pull the strings of 1,000 lives. Those are feeds, Marco said, watching my face. They're going. It was a visible thing. Marco walked to the console, and with an economy of movement that belonged to people who had been given a task often, he switched off the monitors. The screens blinked, went dark. It was a small action, but in it was real refusal of curiosity. Dante watched, silent, and then came and stood beside me. I promised you no access, he said, and you will hold me accountable if I fail. I will, I said. My voice did not tremble now as much as it had. Perhaps it was the forcedness of being watched that made the gesture feel like a hygiene test, a man showing you the jar he'd sterilized. It is simple, but the sight of those black screens had a human effect. It looked less like censorship and more like respect. Later, alone with him in the library, 2 armchairs facing a fireplace that choked out heat, both literal and metaphorical, he told me, in a way that made the room spin, about his mother. He did not give a full confession, not then. He described a night and a knock and a cold pool of somebody else's choices. The story was always edge and not center, the way people tell of trauma to test the waters of sympathy. My mother was killed on a night like this, he said. Not in this house, but in a street with puddles. I was young. I have been trying to press down the kind of fear that lives in that night ever since. Is that why you watch? I asked, because I wanted the map to make sense. Partly, he admitted, and partly because power is a grammar I learned early. You protect what you have by ensuring nobody else can take it. He paused, and the fires in the grate gave a small snap. When I saw you in that video 3 weeks ago, I saw someone who existed without the armor I'm used to. It made me feel reckless. Reckless is one word for a man who buys cameras, I said. He blinked. I did something reckless, yes. The words were a confession and a plea.
He told it as if offering me a route map to his heart, and the map, predictably, was littered with ruins. I felt for him in the way you feel for an animal with a hurt paw. You'd like to help, though you know the animal might bite. I did not forgive him. I did not, in that moment, decide that the world had been right to hand him bread because he'd shown grief. I sat there with my hands folded and my mind cataloging the costs. How many lives had been part of the fort he'd built? How many people had been bruised by decisions with no consent? But I also cataloged the small, honest things. Rosa's gentle practice, Marco's no-nonsense patience, the way Dante ordered the screens down.
There was a boundary I insisted upon then, a small blade set between us. If you think kindness is some tool you can use, you're wrong, I said. You cannot buy my dignity with meals and clothes. I don't expect you to, he answered, but I will provide them if they make your life easier. I thought of my mother, the cupboards bolted and the brittle laughter that passed for a family. I thought of all the mornings I'd learned to say no, and then be glad for the small things. I surprised myself by speaking aloud what I'd planned. A week. You want to keep me until the police find whatever trouble they think you prevented, until this blows over or until I can get my feet under me? Fine. 1 week. On my terms. I meant the terms. My phone, a job, transparency. He studied me, and then, for the first time since I'd seen his smile in the cafe, something like fear touched his eyes. 1 week, he agreed. On your terms. We wrote it down. Rosa initialed. Marco stood at the back with an expression that was not quite fatherly and not quite sentinel. Dante signed his name like a man who had signed many things without looking. But this signature felt different. It was smaller, an attempt to shrink himself to fit the scale of a human arrangement. That night he stood at the foot of my bed and looked at me without saying anything. I expected a touch that would be claim. Instead, he bowed his head and, almost whispering, asked, "Will you sleep? Can I check the perimeter tonight and I will stay outside the door?" Outside the door, I said. It was a refusal dressed as a bargain, and I watched him parse it. He moved back, as measured as a man removing his foot from a domino. Outside the door, he repeated, and there was obedience in the way he said it. Marco took his place by the door, and Dante left the room without turning off a light. He kept his promise. When I woke in the small hours with the aftertaste of panic, there was a shadow in the hall and the faint perimeter of his suit against the frame, but he had not crossed it. In the quiet of morning, I sat on the edge of that bed and tried to decide what the word protection meant when it came from a man whose history had been built on control. I had not decided to stay. I had consented to a test. I had learned to be transactional with the world, and that was how I approached this. Give a week, see if the terms hold, take my life back. Maybe naive, maybe brave, probably both. When Rosa brought my breakfast, she found me scribbling on the napkin where we had written our rules. She didn't tease me. She never did. She placed a cup of coffee in front of me, and her face was a crossed map of caution and warmth. "I like you," she said simply, "even before I met you. You are loud inside your head in ways that will not break you." "Thanks," I said. It felt silly to accept comfort like that, as if it were an indulgence. She nodded to Dante's door. "He will do well if he is loved the right way," she said.
"You sound like you've loved men who are dangerous before," I said. She smiled. An old private thing. "I have loved men who thought their power made them good. I have learned how to put a bed between their hands and mine. You will do the same." I left the napkin under my plate and looked toward the hall where Dante's door remained closed. Outside, somewhere in the estate, the world hummed with the mechanics of things being watched for reasons both noble and selfish. Inside me, a small wild thing sighed, like a lamp being lit in a dark house. I had dressed ugly to be invisible. Instead, I had been found by a man whose name was a rumor and whose promises were fragile. I would stay 1 week. That was the deal. I did not know yet if that week would be a bridge or a cage. I didn't know if the man who had opened his coat in a rain-damp cafe had the capacity to stop the habits of a life built on watching. But I had placed a bet on the only currency I owned, my demand to be seen on my terms. When I left the room that morning, I carried with me a small, steady apprehension. It felt like the hinge between storm and peace. The house breathed around me, full of servants and secrets, and small, sincere attempts at decency. I slipped my phone into my pocket and felt for the first time in a long time the weight of a choice.
If this was a trap, I would walk out. If it was protection, I would learn to accept help without surrendering myself. The difference between the two would be spoken in daily acts, whether my messages stayed mine, whether Marco taught me how to stand without flinching, whether Dante could keep his word when other men demanded more because of his name. Outside, rain began to fall again, as if the city were trying to wash the morning clean. I tucked the collar of the tote around my throat and walked to the garden, the marble cool beneath my shoes, and watched the water bead and run, like small lives finding their own ways down the stones. Rain kept pattering against the garden hedges, pulling silver threads down the leaves, when I closed the door behind me and let the sound fill whatever hollow was left inside. The napkin with our rules still lay folded on the breakfast table, like an emblem. I meant a week. I meant to treat it like a borrowed umbrella, use it until the storm passed, then hand it back. The problem with storms, I remembered, is they rearrange what you thought you owned. The first days fell into a pattern that looked less like captivity and more like a strange kind of apprenticeship. Marco taught me how the estate functioned, the hour-by-hour logistics of running a house that was both a residence and a small, self-contained world. He moved with the kind of efficiency that had nothing to do with menace. Watching him was like watching a musician who'd practiced the same piece 1,000 times. Hands economical, voice flat and kind.
He showed me how to fold linen so they matched the angles of the pillows, how to manage inventory for the small shop Rosa wanted to open by the guest wing, and how to hold my ground if someone tried to run past me in a corridor. Rosa fed me like I had been a child she'd never had. Her food was simple and fragrant, stews that tasted like the soups my grandmother made, bread with crusts so thin they shivered, and with every meal she pressed small lessons into my hands. "Stand square," she said once, as if I could arrange my feet like a vow. "Speak your mind slow, let men hear it, then let them answer. Don't let a soft tone be an invitation for them to decide for you." She said it without theatrics, and so it landed heavy and true. The estate's proposed job was real labor. They offered me a role that was practical, managing the little satellite store that serviced workers and staff who didn't want to trek into town. It was a job that meant money and a place to be useful. It also offered me a sense of ordinary dignity. I stocked shelves and balanced invoices, and even on bad days, felt the curious thrill of entering a ledger with a name beside numbers that meant things. Not favors, not hush money, but wage for work done. Dante watched. This was the difficult part to reconcile. He watched me in the way wealthy men watch ships in a harbor. There was attention and also a kind of ownership. But over the first week, there were palpable and observable differences in the way he used his gaze. The monitors he had kept in the study were off, save for one that showed only the weather. When he needed to know something about my life, he asked directly. If he slipped and called someone to check, he called Marco in front of me and asked that I be informed. If he had a question about the shop's inventory, he asked our manager, a woman whose jaw never relaxed and who made me laugh in short, bright bursts. The things that mattered began to look less like secrets and more like ones we could put on a table and move around together. That does not mean the edges were gone. People like Dante do not convert overnight. There were afternoons when his old reflex would surface, a curt order, a question asked to the wrong person, and I would see the muscle twitch of his old life. Once, after a guest had been asked to leave for reasons that should have been handled by law and not by his muscle, I confronted him in the study where the curtains were heavy and the light sifted like dust. "You can't run those men like that and expect there to be no fallout," I said. I kept my voice steady because I wanted my words to land, not ricochet. He folded his hands on his desk, the silhouette of his knuckles white on the mahogany. "They were dangerous," he said. "They meant you harm." "That doesn't justify making them disappear," I said. "There are places for accountability. If someone hurts you, the law is not a suggestion." He met my gaze like someone measuring the weight of a stone.
For a moment, I thought he'd argue. Instead, he leaned back and the line of his throat moved. "I know," he said quietly. "You will hold me to that. And when I don't, when my instincts carry me, I will take the consequence you deem fair. That's the bargain." It was an extraordinary sentence, and in it I heard a kind of willingness I had not expected. Not a clean conversion, but a protestation to be answerable. How you make a sinner answerable is messy. It involves the presence of people who will demand proof. Rosa became that person. Marco, in his plain way, became that person. And I, admittedly, began to shape myself into the one who would demand to see wantingness turned into practice. There was a day midway through the week that felt like a pivot. I had been working in the shop, handing a woman a small packet of coffee when Dante strolled in without the formality of his usual arrival. He moved differently when he came into the shop. No entourage, no coat, only a man in a shirt whose sleeves were rolled up, and the sight of him like that did something awkward to the air. He looked around at the shelves as if he were learning the alphabet of a language he hadn't spoken before. "You did this," he said to me simply, as if the verb mattered. He set his hand on a stack of notepads and adjusted them with the care of someone arranging relics. "This place is practical." "It's not a museum," I said, and then before I could stop myself, I added, "It is honest work." He watched my jaw move and smiled like a person pleased with the small triumphs. "Good," he said, "the honest wait." We closed at 5 and he asked me to sit with him in the garden. There was a bench where 2 people could claim a quiet corner. The sky had the copper bronze of late afternoon. The air smelled of herb soil and cut grass. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small square package. I recognized the shape of jewelry inside the soft tissue. I felt a metal tremor in my palms that was not entirely fear. "I don't do gifts lightly," he said, "and I don't give them as payment. This is not a bribe." "Is that all you ever do?" I asked, because humor flattened the edges of my nerves. His smile was small and honest. "Sometimes," he admitted. He opened the package. Inside was a key, old-fashioned and substantial, hanging on a thin chain. It was the kind of key that belonged to a large house, heavy, ornate, the metal worn smooth by many fingers. He set it on the bench between us like a piece of the world offered. "It will look silly on you," he said. "It will look like a weight," I answered. He placed the chain around my neck with the careful politeness of a man offering an apology. "Then wear it as you please," he said. "It's for the little guest room, but I want you to have it, not as a symbol of ownership, as a symbol of a choice. The key is yours." I kept my hands fisted in my lap. "You know what that means for people who don't get keys." "It means I can open a door," he said.
"It doesn't mean that door belongs to me." For days after, I kept the key under my pillow. It was a talisman and a test. At night, I would flip it between my fingers and tell myself it was a thing I held because I had chosen to stay. That was true in a way. I had chosen to see if his promises would hold. But the act of wearing it to the kitchen felt like carrying the memory of the coat he had given me in the cafe. Warm, but complicated. The consent moment we had rehearsed in private came one evening after we had spent hours talking at length. The week had been as much a negotiation as it had been a truce. We had sat by the fireplace while he told me more about the shape of his world, less the operations and more the contours of his childhood, the way the absence of mercy had been taught like grammar. He described a man whose first language had been fear, and for whom power was a dialect learned early. "I used to believe that if I could simply be a step faster, I could keep everyone safe," he said. "I was wrong." "I don't think you're the only one who believed that," I murmured. He set down his glass and studied me in a way that, in the past, would have meant decision. Instead, he leaned forward and, carefully, asked, "May I kiss you?" It was a small sentence, a single, bright pebble dropped into still water. The request itself rewired the moment. I had expected a move, a sweep designed to claim. Instead, I was given the slim, luminous shape of asking. That asking was both a test and an apology. It asked permission and signaled that the old grammar might yield to a new one. My answer came before my head caught up. "Yes," I said, because something in me had been aching for a consent that did not come laced with barter. He moved like a man who had been practicing restraint, slow and sure, and pressed his lips to mine. It was nothing like the cinematic crush I'd expected. It was soft and searching, like someone mapping a coastline he had never seen. He tasted faintly of wine and smoke and something else, salt, maybe the residue of worry. When he broke the kiss, he rested his forehead against mine and breathed out as if the air released had been held for a long time. That night we crossed a line that was not a surrender so much as an agreement to move at the same time. The intimacy that followed was careful. It had no breathless claiming, no storyline of ownership. When I flinched at a touch that felt too certain, he stopped and asked if he had hurt me. When I asked him to wait, he waited. There were small currents of irony in that practice. A man who once took by habit, now learning how to ask. I did not, after that, treat softness as a sign of safety. Softness is not always harmless, but the fact that he had asked meant something fundamental had shifted. It was the first time, in a very long time, that someone had paused to invite me onto a shared path, rather than dragging me into his. The middle of the week brought an unexpected breach.
I had been arranging bags for the shop when the house's comms burst into a chorus of terse voices. It started as a rumble, Marco's boots on the ground, then Rosa calling names, then Dante's voice bent into clarity. I saw him move through the hallway like a man converting motion into decisions. "Stay inside," Rosa said to me, voice flat. "Lock the front, stay by the back door." My hands tightened around the paper bags, and I felt the old hollow of dread spread like a stain. I had been told there would be threats. It had been part of the bargain. But knowing the theory and standing in the center of the actual watch are different beasts. We gathered in the study, Marco crouched by the door with a gun that was heavy in its case, Rosa with her face folded into a mask, and Dante at the window watching the road. Outside, shadows had collected into shapes and then into the headlights of unfamiliar cars. An audible, hard thing rolled under the estate's hedges. The beacons of someone else's men scraped at the property's edge like knives seeking purchase. "They're watching the perimeter," Marco said. "A probe, likely testing to see how we respond." Dante's jaw set. "Who was running it?" He spoke the name like a curse. Calabrese. The word landed in the room like a splinter. I had seen their tags on graffiti in the industrial stretch of the city near the docks. Their face and rumor matched the intimidation I had felt all my life. They were not the kind to ask kindly. They looked for fractures to exploit. Dante made a choice quickly, but not without checking in with us. He came to the center of the room, and in one of the briskest transactions of power I'd seen from him, asked for our input. Marco said the driveway should be reinforced, and that the guards needed repositioning. Rosa noted that the staff needed to be moved inside discreet safe points. I gave what felt like the smallest, most important practical idea. Ensure the guests' room keys were accounted for. Make it difficult for someone to slip in masked as help. He did not bristle at my suggestion. He accepted it, and then, to my surprise, asked the staff to gather in the common room so he could speak to them. He apologized for the upheaval, and in a voice that was adult and honest, told them the estate would not accept breaches. He also said, emphatically, that he would not take action that would harm any of them. "We will respond," he said, "but we will not target civilians. Everyone on this property is protected labor, not collateral." It was an important nuance. He was willing to defend the house, but he framed defense as determination rather than revenge. It showed the possibility of a rule-based reaction rather than the lawless one I had feared. The probe intensified that night. Cars slowed past the gate, slowed again as the security lights threw glare onto plates. A man on a motorcycle tried to gauge the driveway and then retreated.
We watched shadows press and withdraw like a tide that did not find purchase. The estate's alarms woke the neighborhood like a thrummed instrument. At one point, a distant window shattered, someone sending a message, and my body learned again what panic tasted like. Dante's response was swift. He called in favors that had nothing to do with threat and everything to do with community. Local watchmen, people who ran the ferry across the river, even a retired cop who kept a small shop around the corner and owed one of Dante's proxies a favor. It was a network that blurred the line between legal and protective. He walked that line precisely. He called no one to teach a lesson. He ordered the gates closed and organized safe points for the staff and guests. He sent Marco to position at the south hedge. He asked Rosa to make sure everyone had a plan, and he stayed inside and watched the men move with the precision of someone choreographing a war. When the lights faded from the road and the probe withdrew like an unsated thing, a tension remained. We had been tested. We had held. People on the property were shaken. Rosa with a white face, staff who had been sent home, some with children who could not stop trembling. Dante moved among them like someone trying to give a steady hand. He spoke to a trembling night shift worker and arranged to have her husband pick her up. He left envelopes with money for emergencies. He sat with someone whose hands would not stop shaken and held a silence that was not a pity but a presence. There were consequences. The probe had been an overt warning. A rival family had consulted the edges to see what would happen if they pushed. People noticed who answered quickly and who buckled. For someone like Dante, it meant he had to make decisions about how much of his life would be a shield and how much would be a liability. For me, it meant reassessing what staying would do. Protection is double-edged. It makes you safe, but it also flags you as valuable, and value is what is contested. There was another day in the week when I said no, to a public dinner, to his desire to parade the household as proof of normalcy. He had arranged a small reception, the kind with polite voices and soft music, and asked if I would attend. "It will be good for the estate," he said. "People need to see you comfortable." "No," I said. It was a short word. I felt guilty. The air had been heavy with his effort, and the staff had been rehearsing the menu. But the thought of walking into a room where everyone watched me like a curiosity made my stomach flip.
He regarded me for a long time, then nodded. "Understood," he said. "You will not attend." Later, in the late dark, when we both had our cups of tea, he said, "I thought you would. I thought you owed me for the week." "You don't buy my appearances," I said. "You don't get to decide my public life. If I go to the dinner, it has to be for me, not as an exhibit." He agreed without argument.
He learned with a surprising tenderness to treat refusal as instruction, not affront. That in itself was a fragile, important change. When a man used to getting his way responds to a refusal with acceptance and then gently rearranges his actions so you do not have to fight, that is accountability in motion. On the day I had planned to leave, marked on the napkin where we had both signed, I packed my bag with an even-handed calm. I had chosen the week like a small experiment. If his promises could hold, I would consider staying longer under conditions. If they could not, I would leave and never look back. There was a small ache in my throat that morning, like the feeling you get before learning what a test has meant. I left the key under my pillow for a moment and then pulled it up and looped it over my hand. Dante walked me to the car. He looked nervous, unpracticed in the small acts of ordinary life, like a young man about to say something vital to his lover for the first time. "If you leave," he said, voice small, "and you find that we've broken the rules, call me. Rose's number, Marco's number, my number. If I have ever been wrong, tell me. I will answer." "I will," I said. I didn't trust that I would call, but I also didn't want to commit myself to the kind of absolution that forgot the ways he'd harmed. I opened the car door and slid inside. The bag on the seat was lighter than I expected. We stood on the gravel for a second like two figures in a photograph. There was a gentleness to how he touched my cheek, an experimental thing, not ownership, but care. "May I hold you?" he asked. It was almost an identical sentence to the one he'd asked before he had kissed me. Small request, big meaning. I closed my eyes and leaned into him for one beat, and then stepped away. It felt like a prayer I couldn't finish. "I have to see if this holds," I said. He nodded. "I understand." I left. The car drove away and his house receded into a cluster of lights. The weeks that followed were an anxious, careful stretch of life. I took the job at the shop and made a modest list of small rules: check-ins with Rosa, periodic meetings with Dante where he would openly report on what parts of his operations had been scaled back, and a daily text log where I could note things that made me uncomfortable. He acquiesced to all of them. But the world does not rearrange at the request of a napkin. Dante's name carried weight beyond the estate. The probe had been a signal. His neighbors, more violent and less patient families, would not simply vanish because he decided to limit his own reach. There were consequences to removing surveillance. Information that had been collected for the sake of keeping people safe was also income and power for others in his orbit, and letting go of it meant someone else might step in. There were days when his old world pushed back. A favor he refused to perform drew weary men to his door. A conduit he closed found another channel. He had to make choices that would leave some men angry. He did not hide the fact that his decisions cost him influence. "Do you regret it?" I asked once, in the raw way you ask a person about their repentance. He took his time before answering. "I regret some things," he said. "I regret only inasmuch as they cost others. I do not regret deciding I will try to be different. It is exhausting to be your better half and your worst enemy." I witnessed the way he began to move differently through his world. He stepped back from decisions that would harm civilian lives. He put lawyers between certain transactions and insisted on counsel that did not always nod in the ways he used to prefer. He made restitution where he could. He also lost advantages, small, potent things that his enemies noticed. That he took the hit was evidence of change worn into action, and not just into vows. There was a night 3 weeks after the cafe incident when my apartment building near the docks suffered a break-in. Not violent, but invasive. A neighbor's front door had been forced. Pictures were taken, drawers rifled. The news reached the estate because the staff were connected in ways I had underestimated. Rosa called me and put the details into a soft voice. "They took nothing of worth," she said, but it was a message. I sat on the edge of my bed and felt the old gooseflesh of vulnerability. I called Dante, more for the logic of asking someone not to be alone than from any belief he could erase fear. He drove over in 20 minutes. He came into my building wearing a jacket that looked ordinary and a face that was all business. He asked the superintendent for the log and then walked the perimeter himself.
They're testing, he said after a while, to see how close they can come. You can't stop everyone, I said. But you can put people at risk by carrying me like a banner. He listened. There was a small tightness to his jaw that suggested both admission and pain. I'm sorry, he said. I will be cautious. And he was. He arranged for extra door locks to be installed for the building and paid for them without ceremony. He recommended a local watchman who had been replaced and put him on the payroll in exchange for neighborhood hours. He did not throw weight at the problem in a way that would have escalated it. He did not instruct his men to flatten the street. He took quieter measures, improving lighting, replacing the door frame, installing a buzzer system that was simple and lawful. He involved me in the decisions. What would make you feel safe? He asked, genuinely. I told him I wanted control of who was allowed to enter my building. He arranged for a tenant-led board to manage the buzzer. He wrote a check to cover the repairs. It was not the bold, male-grace solution I had been conditioned to expect. It was boring, practical problem-solving. The weeks settled into months like water finding a channel. Our relationship was messy and unglamorous.
There were nights when I hated the way his name made my breath stumble. There were nights when I loved the way Rosa's soup lifted the edges of the dark. We had arguments that were not cinematic. They were about money matters and whether I would take a small vacation into town and who would be the one to tell a gardener about a pay raise. We navigated the practicalities of living across the enormous wealth gap. How much of my privacy I would sacrifice, how visible I would be, whether I wanted to sit in certain rooms while visitors from his past arrived. He asked permission before meeting women he'd once known and sent me messages telling me who he had seen and what had been discussed. He offered me a share in events involving harm to the community and invited me to voice my opinion. I learned that he could hear me, and that sometimes hearing had teeth. Marco became a quiet presence in my life, less a shadow and more a reluctant mentor. He took me to a small self-defense class in the city, run by a woman whose hands were calloused and whose voice cut like scissors. You do not have to be good the first day, she told us. You only have to want it. Marco trained with the patient, flat demeanor of a man who had once been rough with skill and now sought to shape the skill in others rather than use it on them. He would correct a stance and then give a joke, small, drought-riddled humor that stitched trust into my days. There were times when the past reached out with swollen fingers. I would open a newspaper and find a whisper of someone's misdeed, and in the margins of articles, Dante would be present, named to have done something conditional, something that had consequences. He would receive terse letters from men who had lost income because he had shut down a conduit. I watched him sign papers and pay out sums and answer to things that had been the cost of his power. He did not minimize the scale of wrongdoing. He did not attempt to rewrite the ledger. He accepted that changing meant paying in ways beyond promises. That acceptance, ugly and costly, made room for the notion that his transformation was not a theater. One evening, months into our arrangement, I came home late from an inventory count. The shop had been busier than usual, and my body was tired in a bone-deep way. I unlocked the buzzer and stepped into the building. My phone vibrated with a single message, an image of the key on its chain, sent from an unknown number. I froze. It was one of those small actions that make the old fear electric. The image had been taken by someone who had been around me. It was a claim that someone watched who I was with and could track where I slept. I called Dante without thinking. He answered on the second ring. The voice on the phone was calm but tight. Are you all right? No, I said, I'm not. Who sent this? He was silent a moment. Someone who resentfully catalogs my life, he said finally. I'm sorry, we'll find them.
He stayed on the line until I was inside my apartment and had locked the door. Marco came over and sat on my couch with a cup of tea that smelled of ginger and stitched stories. He did not read me like property. He asked what I needed, and I told him to feel safe. He nodded and made a plan in the most unromantic form possible. Changed locks, spare keys with neighbors, a check-in schedule. He did not promise to erase the world. He promised to do the next possible humane thing. That bronze modesty defined our months. Dante did more than say sorry. He sat with the cost. He reduced the number of people who had access to the feeds. He enrolled in a program that placed parts of his holdings under legal oversight. It was not the kind of radical renunciation that cleared a bank account and turned his life into a monastery. It was the kind of slow pruning that left him both diminished and more present. He visited a counselor, once in the estate's library, and then again. He did not rush me into certainties, and he asked me about the limits I wanted enforced. His accountability process became public knowledge to his inner circle, and that transparency cost him favors he had grown comfortable with. I extended my stay, not because I could not or would not leave, but because the thing that changed was not him alone, it was us. There were moments, small, indelible, that stitched me to him in ways I had not expected. Once, when Marco was injured in a scuffle on the perimeter, a minor wound, a cut on the hand that needed a stitch, I watched Dante sit in emergency and be small in a way that did not ask me for forgiveness. He held the saline while Rosa stitched. He sang marinara songs to Marco in a rough baritone until the man laughed and the corner in his eye opened. He was present in ways that were not grand gestures, but were continuous. The rupture came eventually, as ruptures do. A rival, someone who resented Dante's new posture, decided to punish the idea of change by taking an innocuous person as a message. It was not me. It was a boy who worked in the neighboring market. Their cousin had once crossed lines with more militant men and paid the price. They took him and left a small public video that made the city squirm. Dante responded, and his response was complicated. He used legal means where he could. Lawyers, contacts in a district attorney's office who had been quietly informed about certain threats. He also pulled in men who had been his past instruments and told them he wanted the boy found and the threat neutralized. He called me to the study afterwards and closed the door. He did not defend the violence. He did not romanticize the retrieval. "I made a choice to stop some of this," he said, "but I can't allow innocent people to be used as leverage. I'm tired of being the person who sits and takes words and signs papers," I said. "I don't want you to be a pit between two fires." He listened. His eyes flicked with regret. "I know," he said.
I will do better. I will ask before I act. I will check with you. I will not make decisions that put you or anyone else in harm's way without warning." The boy was rescued. It was messy, and the rescue had cost a man who'd been part of Dante's old circle his freedom for a time. There were arrests, hearings, and people who called Dante names I could not repeat without getting sick. There were reporters whose ink smelled like pain. Dante endured the publicity he had once courted for power. He accepted legal scrutiny and faced it with a face that looked, sometimes, like penance. Months passed. I moved into a small flat on the estate's periphery, an apartment that belonged to staff. It was mine by arrangement. The key necklace still hung at my neck. I had a rhythm. Mornings at the shop, afternoons sorting accounts, evenings where I sometimes sat with Dante in the kitchen while Rosa cooked, and Marco read old detective novels aloud. Sometimes we would go for walks in the walled garden and speak of things like cheap coffee and which streets smelled like bread. Sometimes the old tension would flare and we would argue, furious and childish in turns. He would ask for forgiveness and I would say, "That will cost you actions, not words." He would try to pay that toll. He did not always succeed. There were tangible changes that proved his effort. He stopped asking Rosa for inventory details about my life. He opened a small, legitimate enterprise, a logistics firm that contracted for legal shipping and delivery, partially designed to offer work to men he had previously relied on for gray area work. It was a clumsy, earnest thing, not without its critics. Some men lost easy money, and they barked. He weathered it. He arranged funding for a small community center near the docks, where the kids could come and learn welding and carpentry and have time, and he sat at its opening with a look that was both proud and uncomfortable. He did not wave like a man who'd wanted adoration. He looked like someone who had been handed the task of changing the map. Our intimacy changed too. Consent became an ongoing ritual rather than a single event. He learned to ask before a touch, which sounds simple until you understand a life learned by taking. We planned nights together. We planned nights apart. I found my voice in the small things, asking him not to show up at my work in full entourage, asking him to introduce me as Maya to his friends without qualifiers. He did so and then practiced not being offended when someone in his circle asked questions he no longer wanted to answer. A small public test came when Dante's sister, an older woman with the ferocity of family front lines, arranged a celebration and invited me. I told him I would attend on my terms, a quiet entrance, an early leave, and not to put me on display. He bargained with me in his old language. "You will be safe," he said. I named my terms. He accepted them.
The event was tense. Old faces, a cousin who articulated a promise and a wink. Some guests stared, their eyes sharp as if cataloging my features. I treated them with the blunt politeness of someone who had life to squander, but dignity intact. Dante watched me like a man who had learned to admire from a new angle. He never once called me his that night. One afternoon, nearly 6 months since the rainy cafe, Rosa called me into the kitchen for something that smelled like citrus and permanence. She handed me a small box, wrapped in paper with a thin ribbon.
Inside, beneath tissue, was a thinner, newer key. "He had this made," she said, "for you. Not the houses, the shops." I stared at it. It was smaller, crisp, and felt like the kind of key you get when someone trusts you to hold the money. "What is it for?" I asked. "For your counter drawer," Rosa said. "It's your till now. He asked me to give it to you." I laughed, a short, incredulous sound, and then I cried because the gesture meant more than anything he could have said. It was not grand, not flung across a table with a proclamation. It was small and hard, and asked for nothing but stewardship. I hooked it to my own chain and felt the weight there, heavy with responsibility and with a kind of tenderness I didn't trust at first. Change is not tidy. Even with keys and contracts and counseling, the old bloodline of his world pulled at his sleeve. There were nights when men came to his door asking for favors, and he had to refuse them. Men with whom he'd had old friendships became cold and then hostile. There were whispers that his moral recalibration had cost him in alliances. He bore that cost. He also bore the cost of his own public scrutiny. Men who'd once praised him for efficiency now chuckled about his new softness. He would often say to me late, as we sat on the steps of the little shop counting receipts, "I didn't expect this to be lonely." "You could have chosen a different life without me," I said once, not entirely kind because I was tired from ledger balancing. "I did not choose you to make the change," he said. "I chose you because when I saw you, the world told me I had room to be better. But the being better part, that was mine." He kept his promises in the daily things. He asked before he touched. He notified me when he had to meet someone who could threaten our security. He let Marco teach me the defensive moves that made my shoulders less likely to cave under fear. He apologized when he slipped. He also accepted correction without pride. He told me once, on a chilly afternoon, that we both had to sign a new kind of contract. "Not of words on a napkin," he said, "but of behavior and of consequence. If I fall into old patterns, you can and will leave. If you see me using my name as a cudgel, you'll tell me, and I will go to therapy or to public accountability. I want you to have the right to enforce the thing you need to feel safe."
We wrote a document, ridiculous and adult, with clauses and checkboxes that Rosa initialed with a flourish and Marco signed with a grunt. It was silly and necessary. It felt like a way to put the relationship into the language of responsibility, where it could be referred to and enforced. At the bottom of the page, Dante wrote in a hand I had not expected to see from him, "I will try, and if I fail, I will answer." I signed beneath it, and my hand shook. The months rolled forward in small, sometimes terrifying ways. There were nights when I would wake and panic stark and bright. A siren, a shadow, the sudden knowledge of being observed. Dante never mocked this. He would sit in the corridor with me, cup of coffee, and keep a vigil that was not performance. "You don't have to explain the past to me," he said. "You can tell me only what helps you breathe." In time, I expanded the list of things I would accept: steadier employment, a place in the neighborhood's initiatives he had funded, invitations to sit on a board for the community center. I asked that when he used force, he do so only in ways that involved counsel and evidence, not a whim. He agreed. He instituted a local review panel that involved a retired judge and a couple of community leaders who could be called on to review decisions that might have legal ramifications. It was an ugly, bureaucratic thing, but it made the edges feel less sharp. There were still men who thought I was foolish to live with a man like him. Friends whispered the words safety and risk until they became a chorus. I listened, and then I chose again, later and better, not out of fear or capitulation, but because the work of us was visible. He could still be clumsy, and sometimes the oldness reasserted itself. A phone ping he hadn't told me about, a question in a tone that felt instructive. Each time I called him on it, and each time, usually, he made amends. Sometimes his amends cost him. One autumn afternoon, Dante came to the shop smiling in a way that looked a little dumb. He handed me an envelope, and inside was a small, official-looking card. "I spoke with the city about funding for apprenticeships," he said, "and they agreed, mostly because they think I made a public show of being reformed. It doesn't matter why. It matters that some kids will learn a trade." I read the card and felt the muscles in my neck loosen. "You did this for the neighborhood," I said. He took a breath. "I did it because you said the kids needed something else," he said, "because you made me see the places where the map could be changed." There were nights when I still felt the cold, clean edge of being observed.
There were nights when his eyes would catch mine, and his hand reached for mine, and my instinct would be to pull away. But slowly, incrementally, with keys and nights and the small domestic things, I discovered there was a life in which my choices were meaningful.
One evening, nearly 9 months from when he had picked me out in the cafe, Dante surprised me by taking my hands and leading me to the small garden. The fountain tinkled like a memory of rain. He had arranged a seat beneath a pear tree, and there was a small wooden box set on his lap. His face was open in a way I'd seen few times, open like a book with a single important line. "I spent a long time being dangerous," he said. "I spent a long time thinking control was protection. Then someone gave me an ultimatum I didn't even know I needed. You." My breath hitched. "This feels like a confession," I said, because sometimes humor kept me from being swallowed. "It is," he agreed, "and I have tried to live into it. I am not clean, my hands are not laundered of everything, but I do not want my life to be a hazard to you or to others." He opened the box. Inside lay a smaller key, gilded and attached to a thin chain. It was more ornate than the shop key, but finer, softer. I recognized the weight of it, the politics of jewelry, a token, perhaps, of a different sort of claim. "I want you to have this," he said. "Not because I think you belong to me. God knows I am beyond that kind of arrogance, but because I want you to hold something that means you have a choice to lock or unlock. If you wear it, it's because you choose to. If you give it back, it's because you choose to. I don't have the right to demand either." I wanted to laugh then cry, and both were a single thing in the throat. There was a memory of the coat whose cedar had smelled like Mansum, and a memory of the key he had first placed on my neck like an experiment. This key was different. It was not a house key. It was a private key crafted like a promise. I slid the chain over my head and felt the metal warm to my skin. "I'll wear it if only to remind you you asked," I said finally. He smiled with a quiet that had nothing to do with triumph. "Wear it for both of us," he said, "for the fact that we tried." There would be more tests. Men who had been angry with Dante did not vanish. There were seasons of harsher threats that forced him to make choices that sometimes meant people he had once favored were cut off. There was still public scrutiny. There were nights when my phone buzzed with messages from friends warning me not to trust him. There were times when I wanted to leave, furious at the residual forms of his control. In those nights, he did not beg. He listened. He rearranged habits. He took small punishments without theatrical bluster. He would walk away from a meeting for days if I asked him to, simply because I needed space from what his presence implied in the world. The thing that finally anchored me was not a single event, but a series of dull, honest things. He asked permission for more than kisses. He let me decide which rooms to keep private. He took specific men who had run operations and forced them, by legal way and not violent way, to either come clean or be cut off. That would be too simplistic, and it would erase the consequences of his past. But the work he began, public, costly, often ugly, was a movement toward a better grammar of power. I kept the key, I kept the shop, I kept the voice that said no when I needed to. Some nights we sat quiet and listened to the rain, and I found that I could be near him without feeling small. When I think back, the image I carry is not of the coat in the cafe, but of the key warm against my chest, something I touched on days when I needed to remind myself that the difference between cage and home is not always obvious, but it is known when two people choose to act differently, again and again, until the new habit lays down like a trail you can follow. The rain came again that afternoon, soft and steady against the hedges. I looked down at the key and mouthed a name that no one but me would say. Not a plea, not a vow, but a recognition that whatever happened next would be negotiated, messy, and ours. I let the water bead on the metal and watched it run off, and for once, the idea of being seen did not make my chest recoil. It made it possible to breathe.